as the name suggests, we're looking back at how we developed a policy framework for gender mainstreaming in the fishery sector. Basically, I'll introduce it, I'll give you the rationale, talk about what really happened, and then we'll have just a discussion and some conclusion. Essentially, um, we know what gender equity and gender equality is, and I like to distinguish between equity and parity. It's really being fair to both or all genders by creating conditions and opportunities that enable them to enjoy the same of everything: status, entitlements, rewards, resources. There have been development in terms of policies in the community from the late 1900s to the 2010s. But there has been also the persistence of some gender inequalities and inequities in several areas. And what this has meant, for example, the issue of boys and men displaying low educational performance, social deviance, and a numerical prevalence in the criminal justice system. There have been impacts on women as a result of gender-based violence, and women's labor force participation is not yet commensurate with their educational attainment, notwithstanding that they have been in the maid attaining more. But consistent with international obligations, our countries have sought to infuse gender equity commitments into the policy frameworks and instruments. The gender priorities are linked to varying degrees to the relevant treaties as well as our common fisheries policy. The CRFM has been committed to effectively promoting and supporting the developmental objectives of its member states. And so an essential part of this institutional enhancement of the CRFM was seen to be the production of a policy to guide comprehensive gender equality mainstreaming into the plans, programs, projects, and generally the administration of the fisheries and aquaculture sectors. A formal policy was seen as being the framework for which gender analysis and planning could be integrated in a coherent manner at all levels. What we'll be doing, what I'll be doing in this paper, is look at the efforts to bring the fishery sector up to scratch, as it were, with the gender-related obligations and notable achievements in that regard. The rationale for a gender mainstreaming policy is to formalize the mandate, the global fisheries arrangements, the international directions. We needed to formalize that mandate for general mainstreaming, such that the policy would set out as a mechanism, as an organization, as a community, the gender equality goals and commitments to continuous and conscious effort to achieve the expected results, with actions that will detail, the related indicative strategies and interventions and so forth. So a number of things that a gender mainstreaming policy was seen as doing: providing that mandate, those resources, the systems, the training for fisherfolk as well as fisheries authorities for integrating gender into culture and policies and programs, to establish a mechanism for charting progress. How do we know that we're moving along the way we want to move along within the member states themselves and affiliated sectoral organizations and key stakeholders? How would we support the policy would support the capacity of member states to examine and address the gender issues that have a bearing on the growth and developmental policies of our member states in the political, social, socio-cultural, cultural, economic, and socio-economic spheres? How we promote the equal participation of men and women, boys and girls, in realizing the vision of our common policy, taking advantage of the opportunities and benefiting from its implementation. How would we then support values that lead to the attainment of a culture of gender justice, mutual care, peace, and harmony between women and men and boys and girls within fisheries-related households and communities and institutions in our member states, and creating an awareness and education about the importance, about the priority among the stakeholders in the fisheries and aquaculture sector. So basically, looking back at 2018, we had the then existing strategic objectives of the mechanism, and we looked at what were the pertinent gender issues. I won't read everything there, but the question of data was an important one. The question of inequalities in management of the resources, the question of slow progress on rights-based approach to development, the question of men and women clustered into different categories of business ownership, in terms of the unequal correlation between what we saw, women's higher educational attainment, but their labor market presence, and many growth strategies in the OECD countries in particular had assumed that women's labor was cheap, and this is definitely not something we want to see. In terms of adaptation to climate change, there were inequalities in management of natural resources. Who does what with what natural resources? How does the impact of the environment, and how does it make women and men more or less vulnerable? Because there are differences in terms of vulnerabilities that came out. For example, after some of the hurricanes in the early to mid 2000s, we saw the question of the impacts of natural disasters and the variable impacts on women as opposed to on men, and on young women as opposed to young men, and young men as opposed to older men. Those variabilities, the question of workplace safety, facilities for childcare and balance of work and family responsibilities. When we're talking about capacity building, I've already mentioned the clusters into different business ownership categories, because some of these things, and I deliberately have them there, repeated them because they related to more than one objective, and I wanted to bring that important point out. And then when in terms of our functional objectives, which are effective collaboration and efficient management, the issues with the task and pay not exploiting women's willingness to work, the responses to workers' complaints should be sensitive to gender. With a tendency when complaints are made through the system, they're not mindful of the fact that the nature of a complaint for a woman is not quite the same as the nature of a complaint for a man, even though they may appear to be about the same thing. When you talk about trade, what are the gender dimensions of trade? And these remain at the center of policies and strategies, but we need to see them coming out. The persistently male character of workplaces, structures of governance that are not really female oriented, notwithstanding the increasing presence and desirability of women in these workspaces. So these are some of the issues. I'm not going to go through all of them. But what actually happened? Well, we at the Secretariat drafted a policy, a nice 16-page document on gender equality and mainstreaming, which was presented to our executive committee. The Ministerial Council looked at it after it came from the executive committee and recognized that, you know what, we're probably not doing as bad as some might think in terms of moving it forward. So they said, well, looky, despite these achievements, there are gender issues that still need to be addressed. So they sent it back to us and said, try and address some of these, revise them and take it through the process again. This was done and submitted to the 32nd meeting of the executive committee for its finalization and further revised again based on that, and taken to the 8th special meeting of the ministerial council. But then what happened? The council, notwithstanding accepting all of that, was unable to reach a consensus because there are many things happening. National gender machineries are already placed to promote gender mainstreaming. There was this concern, and so accepting that, but in view of the cross-cutting nature, the Ministerial Council just decided to issue a statement, a very simple statement, accepting that international and national norms regarding issues pertaining to gender, youth, and decent work be adhered to and be incorporated into all CRFM policies, protocols, programs, and plans. A simple statement, which was reported to the 75th meeting of the Quartet and accepted by the 75th special meeting of the Quartet. I could bring up Myrie versus Barbados and Jamaica, where when a council, an institution of the community, accepts or makes a decision, that decision becomes part of community law. I'll say no more on that from there, but you get my point. So the point is that the council accepted that these norms should be adhered to. A number of activities and actions have been implemented that have placed us in a better position. There was a mainstreaming gender equity in fisheries project funded by Global Affairs Canada with us as a delivery mechanism, and it aimed to improve sustainable fisheries for women and girls and other vulnerable populations. A number of documents, a number of products came out of that, a review of countries' compliance with international agreements, a report on the appropriate gender research. There's a gender analysis, strategy, and action plan. We call it the Gender ASAP on mainstreaming fisheries. Also, this has been approved by the Ministerial Council. National Gender Action Plans have been developed. So the implementation of this and the approach taken has really been involved with stakeholder engagements, capacity building, and at this point in time, 16 of our 17 member countries have actually identified fisheries gender focal points. And this has created a momentum that can contribute to furtherance of the enabling environment for foundational work on gender equality, youth empowerment, and decent work. What it means to me, actually, my interpretation is that in terms of the ability to define and mandate direction, that ministerial statement, in my view, is actually more powerful, more all-encompassing than the 18-page document that we had initially tendered, because it was like almost, in my view, a carte blanche saying whatever you need to do with regard to meeting the international perspectives on gender, put it into all that CRFM does. And for me, that's really all-encompassing. So we have, as a mechanism, as a secretariat, made the commitment to strive to partner at the global, national, and local organizations to greater gender expertise, those that have greater gender expertise than ourselves, to build capacity to collect and understand and act upon the gender information, the private sector, NGOs, and communities as criteria for determining which activities support and to promote broader implementation. With that, thank you.
So I see, Gregory, you have your hand raised. You go ahead.
Excellent as usual, Your Majesty. Um, just food for thought. I could not help but wonder what direction we as a region will move in, given the development in some quarters, the so-called developed world, regarding gender. I understand that there are, in some cases, 70 different categories of definition of gender with their various pronouns. Are these reality, will these reality face us much sooner than we think? Just food for thought.
The ministerial statement does not, it speaks generally in terms of gender considerations, speaking about the fact that policies and documents are all well and good, but there's a need for deliberate action. And we agree with that. The policies and documents provide the basis and the knowledge base on which we can start to put those actions into place. And as a secretariat, we have been working towards that. I mean, I gave the example how the clear actions that have been built into our operations manual to ensure that gender considerations are taken when we're hiring and when we're recruiting. So yes, the documents are good, but we have been trying to start to bring these into action and into fruition. Just in response to the question that statement in the chat. Thank you, Caroline. I think the name was.